Greetings, friends. I'm sorry for the lag between videos. I do have some ideas lined up, but first, I have news. I'm going to be starting a PhD in human rights in May at the University of Sussex. Huzzah! One issue I do have is the funding. The student finance loan basically covers the tuition fees and about 4 to 5 months of rent a year, assuming I don't eat. So in addition to the part-time job, I'm going to set up a Patreon, get a bit of crowdfunding, and I'm going to post some aspects of research on my channel while I'm doing it. Some tangents, some Easter eggs. Anyway, today I'm going to talk about what I'm going to be doing for the next 3 years. Now, yesterday I tried to go through my research proposal, but I almost put myself to sleep. It was 11:30, but still. So I'm going to hit the highlights so you get the angle of what I'm going for. Um, so when you study a PhD, the aim is to come up with something original, to change how academia think about something. Also, ideally to influence society, but to paraphrase my new supervisor, at the end of the day, you're being marked by academics and you have to appeal to them. So what is this new idea, I hear you ask? I'm getting to it. My idea starts with the concept of neurotypical supremacy, which at its most basic is the assumption that being neurotypical is preferable, that not only should it be the norm, but in an ideal world there would not be neurodivergent people. I believe that this basic assumption has deep roots in our society and it affects everything, and that it is self reinforcing like Roman concrete, that when it cracks and the water gets in, the water helps rebuild the concrete. An example of how this works is a large part of psychology research around autism and neurodivergence is built on the understanding that autism and ADHD are deficits. And so, as we have previously discussed in Hugh et al., where we were morally incorrect for not wanting to kill the cats and dogs for money, positive autistic traits like a moral compass are pathologized and twisted into undesirable qualities. Partly because of how neutral neurodivergent traits are pathologized, including differences in communication style. The response to autistic people is to try and cure us, which is most clear with Autism Speaks in the US, which spends a lot of money on trying to find an autism gene in order to prevent more autistic people from existing. As well as being wildly ableist, this has huge moral and legal problems, not least of which that it's in breach of the spirit of the Genocide Convention of 1949. So, even though there's no specific protection for disabled and neurodivergent people, it's very clear that imposing measures to prevent births within the group is a method by which genocide can be committed. My primary research question is broadly to what extent are the human rights of neurodivergent people being oppressed by this systematic neurotypical supremacy, and how can it be challenged through changes in international human rights law? What I am essentially doing is first establishing that there is this sociological phenomenon in which being neurodivergent is deemed undesirable. Secondly, that this phenomenon influences how society thinks about autistic people, and in turn, this affects the language found in national and international laws, which has the effect of weakening or even denying our human rights. A good example of this is the European Charter of Rights for Autistic People, which explicitly states autistic people are unable to envisage the consequences of their decisions. It's wildly infantilizing. Or this delightful UN General Assembly resolution from 2011, which says, aware that autism is a lifelong developmental disability that affects the functioning of the brain, characterized by impairments in social interaction, problems with verbal and non-verbal communication, and restricted repetitive behavior, interests, and activities. The third thing I would do in this PhD, after a tremendous amount of research, will be to suggest a framework to improve the human rights of neurodivergent people from where we are now. That's the basic building blocks. Now I'm going to talk about my approach and some key ideas I will be using. Connected to this idea of neurotypical supremacy is the medical model of disability, which views disability as individual impairments, rather than the idea of universal design, which was a key part in drafting the Conventions on the Rights of Disabled People. Universal design argues that at least part of the reason disabled people are disabled is because society is not built for them. Atkinson talks about how framing autism as a developmental disorder that hinders normal forms of communication means that the societal response to autistic people is to cure us, which reinforces neurotypical supremacy. This is why I will be approaching autism and neurodivergence more widely as a minority group with its own language and culture, which are characteristics that are already protected under human rights treaties. Just to be clear, I will not be arguing that autism or ADHD cannot be disabling. That would be to contradict my own lived experience. However, the question of why it is disabling is never really investigated, and the assumption is it's the result of internal faults. It is my hypothesis that so much of what disables neurodivergent people is how society at large reacts to their differences. It has been understood for over a decade through the so-called double empathy problem that the headline article that defines autism as a disability, social communication, is actually a two-way problem in that neurotypical or normal people find it just as hard to read neurodivergent people as vice versa. The reason I have a problem with the term double empathy problem is that it implies an equal footing, whereas autistic people make up 1 to 3% of the population, and therefore the emphasis has always been on autistic people to adapt and learn the communication style of the majority, which is where masking comes from. If you take double empathy at its face value, it implies that neurodivergent people cannot or do not want to emphasize with neurotypicals, when in reality, autistic people have conformed and essentially speak a second language, albeit with a heavy accent. And as I have talked about before, successive psychological studies have shown that neurotypical people have an instinctive dislike for these differences in communication styles and view autistic people more negatively than their counterparts. And the extent of this instinctive dislike causes widespread socioeconomic problems, which I have talked about in the video responding to Kerry Badenoch's Conservatism in Crisis. Now I'm going to step over the literature review because literature reviews are bad. They're not fun to write, they're not fun to read, they're bad. A key part of my PhD is going to be which theoretical framework I choose to use. In general, I am subtextually using critical disability studies, but specifically I'm going to be using constructivism. So constructivism is a theory that I think is intertwined with the neurodivergent worldview. To oversimplify, constructivists believe that reality is built through social interaction, which manufactures intersubjective understandings on rules, norms, ideas, and values. This applies to concepts which Yuval Noah Harari has termed imagined realities, such as human rights, corporations, nations, and value of money. However, the most important intersubjective understanding for autism is language. The meanings attributed to sounds and symbols, but more importantly, body language and tone, are the result of a social construct. They don't naturally occur. So constructivists, including Anuth, have developed the idea that language creates reality through speech, which means that the way that people respond to speech creates our norms, which then evolve into rules, which then may constrain people in their speech, leading to an outcome where society and people are mutually constructing. However, Cowart discusses how when a society forms an in-group, like a nation, those who cannot speak the dominant language lose the ability to influence the rules and structure of that society, and as a result lose their agency. And this is how a society can be developed which is not built for neurodivergent people, as their ability to challenge the norms have been consistently limited through not having access to the common language that would shape the rules and norms. Autistic people question this intersubjective reality on every level when it comes to social norms, about everything from table manners to gender. And this, in addition to the psychological studies by Sasson, Nakhaudi, and Butcher, which I've talked about before, is one of the points of tension with neurotypical people. By questioning the way things work, autistic people inevitably and sometimes inadvertently threaten a number of hierarchies. Because autistic people do not automatically subscribe to this artificial shared understanding of the world, they are seen as disabled. So that's my general theoretical approach. I know I've used autism and ADHD and neurodivergence interchangeably. My research will be primarily focused on autism. However, as some studies have estimated an overlap as high as 50 to 70% of autistic people also have an ADHD. To leave out or separate ADHD people would completely undermine the research. In the same way, my research will broaden out to include other intersectional identities such as the LGBTQI community, because autistic people are far less likely to identify as heterosexual, as well as disability rights more generally. I hope I haven't bored you to tears. There will be some more general videos coming out again starting next week. I am still looking at the overlap between autism and trans people, but I'm taking my time with it to make sure I get it right. I'm also looking at the role autism played in winning the Second World War and why life expectancy is lower than average. But knowing me, the next video will be something else entirely because I'll find a new kind of interesting detail and I'll follow down the rabbit hole. Anyway, thank you for listening to my epic rambling about what I'm going to be doing for the next 3 years. I hope it's made sense. Any questions are appreciated. Let me know, guys. Have a good day. Goodbye, friends.